The marina had looked like money wearing sunlight. White hulls had shimmered under the afternoon glare. Chrome rails had thrown sharp flashes across the water. Champagne glasses had clinked behind velvet ropes, each sound crisp as a coin dropping. Somewhere on the upper deck of the biggest yacht, a DJ's bass line had pulsed, deep, steady, confident, like the party itself had owned the air. At the end of Pier 7, the yacht had towered over everything else. 3 decks high, white as fresh paint, polished until the hull had reflected the dock like a mirror. Her name, Aurora Bell, had been painted in gold script across the stern, arrogant in its shine. A rope line had stretched across the dock like a verdict. Behind it, security had stood in black uniforms, radios clipped, faces set. A check-in table had held laminated guest lists and wristbands stacked in neat colors, as if order alone could keep the world from spilling in. In front of that rope line, an older black man had stood in a navy blazer and pressed slacks, holding a plain envelope in one hand. He had not looked confused. He had not looked lost. He had looked deliberate, calm in a way that had made people uneasy, as if he had been carrying a secret and had not been afraid of it. "So," the younger guard had said, stepping forward with an outstretched arm, palm up like a stop sign, "you couldn't be here." The man's gaze had rested briefly on the guard's hand before rising to his face. His eyes had been steady, dark, unhurried. "I was expected," he had replied. The guard's eyes had scanned him. Silver hair close-cropped, skin the color of mahogany under the sun. No entourage, no obvious status symbols. The guard's mouth had tightened the way it did when someone decided what you were before you spoke. This was a private event, the guard had said. Invite only. That was the point of the envelope, the man had answered, voice even. A woman in a white linen suit had approached from the check-in table. Sunglasses had covered her eyes, but authority had radiated from her posture, from the way she had walked as if the dock had been built for her stride. Her badge had read Event Director. "What's happening?" she had asked, tone light and practiced, like she had been trained to smile through storms. "He said he was invited," the guard had replied. "He wasn't on the list." The event director had taken the envelope without asking. She had opened it, scanned the paper inside, and then had let out a small, dismissive exhale. "I'm sorry," she had said, handing it back as if it had been a wrong receipt. "This wasn't valid." "It was an invitation," the man had said, not louder, not sharper, just clear. "It wasn't our invitation," she had replied, her smile tightening at the corners. "This event was for members, sponsors, and vetted guests." The word vetted had landed heavy. A couple strolling toward the gangway had slowed. A man in a pastel blazer had smirked like he had been watching a show. A woman with diamonds at her throat had tilted her head, amused, like she had seen this kind of moment before and had always been on the safe side of it. A phone had lifted above the crowd. Then another. A voice had carried from somewhere behind the spectators, excited and sharp. "Yo, you seeing this?" They pressing an old dude at the yacht party. The sound of a live stream starting had been invisible, but the shift in the air had been unmistakable. People had drawn closer, hungry for a spectacle, for a clip, for a moment to share. The older guard had stepped in then, broader shoulders, older face, the relaxed confidence of a man who had been believed his whole life. "Step aside," he had ordered. "You were causing a disruption." "I was standing on a public dock," the man had replied. The older guard had leaned in, voice low and edged with warning. "Not for long." A bystander had called out, "You were really about to arrest him." The older guard had snapped, "Back up." This was secure. Phones had kept recording. The live stream view count had climbed, and with it the crowd's courage. People who would have stayed silent in private had found their voices because the internet had been watching. The younger guard had reached toward the man's elbow. The man had not flinched. He had not stepped back. He had simply said, softly, "Don't touch me." He had not raised his voice, but the tone had carried something final. The younger guard had hesitated. The event director's patience had thinned. "Sir, please, let's not make a scene." The man had lifted his chin slightly. "My name was Marcus Holloway," he had said. The event director had blinked behind her sunglasses. "Okay, Mr. Holloway." The answer was still no. The older guard had tapped his radio, requesting marina enforcement. Possible trespass. The word enforcement had hit the crowd like a spark. "Oh, this about to go viral," someone had whispered. The livestream voice had climbed higher. "Chat, they're calling enforcement. They about to drag him off the dock. Look how calm he is. Why he's so calm?" Marcus had looked toward the yacht again. Music had drifted from above. Laughter, clinking glasses, a cheer rising and falling like waves. It had sounded like a world that did not notice the rope at its feet. He had taken a slow breath. Then he had slipped the envelope into his inner pocket with careful precision, like he had been putting away a tool. He had pulled out his phone. The older guard had smiked, as if the story had ended the moment Marcus had arrived alone. Marcus had tapped a name on his screen. Before the call had connected, he had asked the event director, almost gently, "Did you know who owned this yacht?" She had let out a short laugh. "Sir, please." Marcus had nodded once. "All right," he had said. A siren had whooped faintly in the distance. Phones had leaned closer. The crowd had held its breath. And the call had connected. "Nadia," Marcus had said calmly, loud enough for those nearest to hear. "I was at Pier 7. I was being denied access to the Aurora Belle." There had been a pause on the line. Then the voice had shifted from polite to alarmed. "Denied? By who?" the woman had asked. "Event security," Marcus had replied. "They were calling enforcement." Silence had stretched thin. "Would you like me to take action?" the voice had asked, careful. "Yes," Marcus had said. He had ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket. The older guard had stepped closer. "Last warning." The siren had grown louder. The event director had crossed her arms, lips pressed tight. "You could have avoided this," she had said, voice cool. "Why were you doing this to yourself?" Marcus's eyes had met his, steady and sad. "I wasn't doing this to myself," he had said quietly. "You were." The siren had been close now. The crowd had tensed, bodies leaning forward like one organism. Then a new voice had cut through the tension. "Stop." Heads had turned. A man in a gray suit had hurried down the dock, breath uneven, tablet clutched to his chest like a shield. Behind him, the marina manager had jogged, speaking urgently into a radio. The man in gray had reached the rope line and stared at Marcus as if he had seen a ghost. "Mr. Holloway," he had said loudly, voice tight, "I'm so sorry." The older guard had frowned. "Sir." "Remove the rope," the man in gray had ordered. "Excuse me," the event director had asked, confusion creeping into her tone. The marina manager had stepped forward, face pale. Those orders were rescinded. What was happening? Someone in the crowd had demanded. The man in gray had swallowed and then had lifted his voice for everyone to hear. "What was happening," he had said, "was that you were denying access to the man who just purchased this yacht." Silence had dropped so fast it had felt physical. A phone had slipped from someone's fingers and had hit their palm with a dull smack. The event director's mouth had opened, then closed, then opened again without sound, like the word no had been stuck behind her teeth. Marcus had reached into his blazer and withdrawn a folded document. He had held it up, not like a weapon, but like a fact. The broker's signature had been there. And Marcus's. Funds cleared. Ownership transferred. Effective immediately. The older guard's smirk had died. The younger guard's hand had dropped away from Marcus's elbow as if it had been burned. The crowd had erupted in whispers that sounded like wind in a forest. The livestream voice had screamed, "Chat. He bought the boat. He bought the whole boat." Marcus had exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had carried for years. As the owner of the Aurora Belle, he had said, voice calm, steady, audible to every phone recording, "I was canceling today's event." For a moment, no one had moved. Even the water had looked still. Then the event director had found her voice, sharp with disbelief. "You couldn't do that. There were contracts, vendors, guests. Your legal team could contact mine," Marcus had replied gently. Above them, faces had appeared along the yacht's railing. Partygoers had leaned over, confused, annoyed, curious. "What's going on down there?" someone had shouted. Marcus had looked up. The vessel was closed. He had called, clear and composed. "Please disembark in an orderly manner." A stunned voice had floated down. "Who the hell were you?" Marcus's eyes had held the gaze above. "Someone you didn't recognize as important," he had said, "until you had to." Shock had moved through the dock like a wave. The rope had been lowered. The party had begun to unwind in panic and disbelief. People had filed off the yacht, clutching handbags and half-finished drinks, faces flushed with embarrassment and anger. Vendors had stared at one another, uncertain whether to pack up or protest. Security had stood frozen, suddenly aware that their authority had been built on an assumption that had just collapsed. Marcus had remained still at the center of it all, calm as the eye of a storm, while the world he had been denied had been forced to acknowledge him. The cameras had captured everything, and once the internet had it, the moment had stopped belonging to that dock. It had become everyone's. Earlier that day, Marcus had woken before sunrise, the way he always had. He had not woken early because he had been poor anymore. He had woken early because his body had never forgotten what it had cost to climb. His house had been quiet, the kind of quiet money bought. Thick walls, soft floors, no neighbor's television bleeding through thin drywall. But the quiet had not been what had kept him steady. Memory had. He had sat on the edge of his bed and listened to the world before it put on its masks. He had heard the distant hum of a city waking up, a bird testing its voice, the refrigerator doing its honest work. On his dresser, a photograph had stood in a simple frame. A younger Marcus had smiled in the picture, hard hat too big for his head, dust on his cheeks, eyes bright with exhaustion and pride. His arm had been slung around an older man with grease-stained hands. They had looked like they had just finished building something real. On the back of the frame, in K-full ink, had been written, "We keep our word." Marcus had picked up the photo and held it for a long moment. He had remembered his mother's hands, cracked from cleaning chemicals, nails short, knuckles always slightly swollen. She had cleaned houses for people who never learned her name, who had called her sweetie while leaving their dainty dishes stacked like a test. She had come home smelling like lemon polish and fatigue, and she had still managed to hum while she cooked. He had remembered his father's silence, pride packed so tightly into his chest that it had sometimes sounded like anger. His father had fixed engines and appliances, anything broken that someone could not afford to replace. When Marcus had been a boy, he had watched his father hold a small part up to the light, squint, and then repair it with patience that looked like magic. They had been poor, but they had kept their word. If his father said he would show up, he showed up. If his mother promised she would make something work, she did. Marcus had learned that promises were not about comfort. They were about character. His phone had buzzed. A message from Leona, his assistant and closest confidant. Dock schedule confirmed. Aurora Bell viewing at 2 p.m. Party setup started at 4. "You sure you wanted to go in person?" Marcus had typed back. "I was sure." He had dressed without flash, no loud logos, no attention-seeking jewelry. He had worn clothes that fit well, not because he wanted to impress, but because he respected himself. Downstairs, he had brewed black coffee. He had eaten toast standing at the counter. The day had been heavy in his mind, not because it had been complicated, but because he had known what it could reveal. His hallway had been lined with plaques and framed magazine covers, the proof the world demanded. Holloway Systems acquired for $8.4 billion. The quiet titan of infrastructure. Philanthropist funds hundreds of scholarships. But the thing Marcus looked at the longest had not been any of that. It had been a child's crayon drawing framed beside the headlines. A stick-figure man holding a wrench, with the words "Thank you for fixing things." Marcus had smiled, and something warm had tightened in his throat. Because that had always been the point. He had not built his company to become famous. He had built it to become useful. He had started out wiring buildings, then managing crews, then bidding on contracts that bigger companies had ignored. He had learned to read blueprints the way other people read novels. He had learned to negotiate with men who smiled while they tried to cheat him. He had learned to deliver ahead of schedule because he knew how eager the world was to doubt him. He had been told, more times than he could count, that he did not look like a man who ran anything. He had been mistaken for the driver at galas. He had been offered water and pointed towards service entrances. He had been talked over in boardrooms until he stopped fighting for the floor and started letting results speak for him. and results had been loud. Holloway Systems had grown into a company that built and maintained the bones of cities, power grids, water systems, emergency infrastructure. His work had not been glamorous, but it had been essential. When storms had hit, his teams had restored power before politicians had finished their press conferences. When bridges had needed reinforcement, his engineers had made sure families got home safe. Marcus had never forgotten what it felt like to need someone dependable. So he had become that someone. The yacht purchase had not been vanity. It had been strategy and symbolism. Marcus had been negotiating to buy the Aurora Belle through his holding company for months. He had planned to use it for corporate retreats, scholarship fundraisers, and mentorship weekends for young people who had never been allowed to step into spaces like that without feeling watched. He had intended to honor the existing charter agreement for the weekend. He had believed in keeping his word. But Leona had forwarded him an email from the broker that morning, and Marcus had felt an old, familiar chill when he read it. Client wants discretion. Crew instructed, no access to non-approved guests. Security hired. Event high profile. Marcus had stared at the phrase non-approved guests until the words had started to blur. He had known what that language often became in practice. He had lived long enough to smell the quiet gatekeeping hiding behind polite phrasing. So he had decided to go in person, alone. Not because he enjoyed confrontation, because he respected truth. He had wanted to see what kind of world was being hosted on a vessel he was about to own. He had wanted to know whether the Aurora Belle was just a yacht or a floating fortress of bias. On the drive to the marina, the city had slid past like a film. Glass towers, brick buildings, cracked sidewalks, a man pushing a cart loaded with recyclables, a woman in scrubs eating breakfast in her car before a shift, kids in uniforms waiting at a bus stop, shoulders hunched against the morning. Marcus had watched them and thought about how each person carried a story no one could see. He had remembered his own, how he had studied at night after construction shifts, how he had taken community college courses and then transferred, how he had worked double jobs and still sent money home. He had remembered the day he had been promoted to foreman on a major site, and a white subcontractor had laughed and said, "Who put him in charge?" Marcus had not argued. He had just delivered. And the laughter had stopped when deadlines were met and mistakes were fixed and the numbers made sense. That had been his pattern. Calm. Work. Proof. He had arrived at the marina early and had sat in his car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. He had whispered something to himself, the way he always had before stepping into spaces that loved to pretend he did not belong. Keep your dignity. Keep your word. Then he had stepped into the sunlight. He had walked toward Pier 7, envelope in hand, expression neutral. He had expected scrutiny. He had expected skepticism. He had not expected the humiliation to be so casual. But when the rope line had stopped him and the word vetted had been thrown like a net, he had felt something old rise in his chest. Not rage, not hatred, but a weary sadness. Because he had been 68 years old, and the world had still been trying to decide his worth by the surface. Back on the dock, the confrontation had escalated as if the crowd itself had been feeding it. The older guard had squared his shoulders and spoken louder, as if volume could replace legitimacy. This was a high-profile event, the guard had said. You needed to leave now. Marcus had stayed still. I had an invitation, he had replied. The event director had gestured at the guest list with a sharp flick of her hand. Your name wasn't here. That was the end of it. Marcus had looked at the list, then back at her. Lists were made by people, he had said quietly. People made mistakes. Her smile had sharpened into something mean. Not this list. A man in the crowd had laughed. Come on, Grandpa, just go. Someone else had said he was probably trying to sneak in. The livestream comments had flooded with assumptions, some cruel, some supportive, all loud. Marcus had heard the whispers, but he had not reacted. He had been thinking about how easily the crowd had believed the worst. He had been thinking about how often the world asked black men to prove they belonged in places where others were assumed to belong by default. The younger guard had shifted nervously as the phones kept recording. The event director had leaned closer to Marcus, voice lower, almost intimate, as if she had been offering him a secret kindness. So, she had said, you didn't want trouble. Just step away. I didn't want you getting hate. Marcus had looked at her sunglasses and wondered what her eyes looked like when she was alone, when no one was watching her performance. I didn't want trouble, Marcus had said softly, but I didn't want to shrink either. The older guard had called for marina enforcement. The siren had approached like a judgment. The crowd had tightened, shoulders brushing. Someone had begun to chant, half joking, half serious. Let him in. Let him in. The event director had hissed, "Stop filming," as if the cameras were the problem, not the moment. But the cameras had only been holding up a mirror, and the mirror had not been flattering. When the broker and marina manager had arrived, breathless, apologizing to Marcus in front of everyone, the event director's authority had crumbled in real time. Her mouth had opened in protest, but the words had not mattered anymore. Reality had spoken louder. When Marcus had cancelled the event, the shock had been immediate and visceral. People had stared as if the dock had tilted. On the yacht above, confusion had turned to panic. Guests had begun to descend the gangway, faces tight, some furious, some mortified, some suddenly eager to disappear before their names became part of the story. A man in a designer shirt had shoved past a vendor and snapped, "This is ridiculous. Do you know who I am?" The vendor had stared back blankly, holding a tray of untouched hors d'oeuvres like a shield. A woman with a bright smile and expensive perfume had tried to laugh it off as if it were a joke, but her eyes had darted to the phones recording her reaction. Someone had yelled at the security guards, "Why didn't you know?" The older guard had looked like he had swallowed ice. The younger guard's hands had trembled near his radio. The event director had stepped toward Marcus, her voice rising. "This is a breach. We had agreements. You were. This was." Marcus had lifted a hand, and she had stopped, not because she had wanted to, but because the crowd had recognized something in his gesture: control, certainty, a calm that did not need permission. Marcus had spoken to the marina manager quietly. "Please make sure the staff got paid," he had said. "The vendors too." The marina manager had blinked, surprised. "So, they were doing their work," Marcus had replied. "They shouldn't suffer for this." The event director had stared at him like she could not understand kindness without weakness. Marcus had turned back to her, voice still gentle. "This wasn't about ruining your day," he had said. "It was about stopping a pattern." Her face had flushed. "A pattern?" Marcus had nodded once. "The kind you didn't notice because it benefited you." The crowd had fallen quiet again, the silence heavy with realization. And then marina enforcement had arrived, two officers stepping onto the dock with hands near their belts, scanning the crowd, prepared to remove a trespasser. They had seen Marcus. They had seen the broker's tablet. They had seen the marina manager's panic. And then they had seen the folded document in Marcus's hand. The officers' posture had shifted. Their faces had smoothed into professional neutrality. One officer had approached the marina manager and spoken quietly. The marina manager had nodded, sweating. The officer had turned toward Marcus, respectful. "Sir," he had said, "was there anything you needed from us?" Marcus had looked at him. "Just to ensure people left safely," he had replied. The officer had nodded. "Yes, sir." The word "sir" had landed differently now. It had not been forced. It had been correct. The crowd had reacted to that too. The way authority had bent instantly once ownership had been revealed. The live stream had caught it all. The internet had not missed the lesson. By the time the sun had set, the clip had been everywhere. It had been edited into slow-motion moments. The rope line, the word vetted, the siren, the broker's apology, Marcus's calm face as he canceled the event. Music had been added in some versions, dramatic strings swelling as the reversal hit. Subtitles had appeared, bold and accusatory. People had argued in comment sections, some defending the security as doing their job, others calling out the obvious. But the footage had been too clear. There had been no misunderstanding in the event director's smile when she said vetted. There had been no confusion in the guard's smirk when he called enforcement. And there had been no denying the way their posture changed when they learned Marcus had owned the yacht. It had been a story the internet loved, humiliation turning into power. But for Marcus, it had felt like something else. It had felt like grief. Because it had been familiar. Because he had seen it too many times. just wearing different clothes. The next day, Marcus had sat in a conference room overlooking the same water. The window had framed the marina like a postcard, calm and pretty, as if it had not hosted a public fracture. Across the table, the investment firm's representatives had sat stiffly. Their suits had been expensive, their expressions carefully managed. A lawyer had spoken first, voice smooth. "Mr. Holloway, we would like to discuss damages. The event's cancellation caused significant." Marcus had held up a hand, not rude, just clear. He had not been interested in theatrics. He had been interested in consequences that mattered. He had listened as they talked about contracts, deposits, reputational harm, inconvenience. Then he had slid a folder across the table. Inside had been documents, vendor compensation agreements, staff payment guarantees, a settlement structure that ensured the people who had been working would not be punished for the choices of those in charge. The lawyer had blinked. "You were paying them?" Marcus had nodded. "They showed up to do their jobs," he had said. "They deserved to be paid." One of the firm's executives had leaned forward, brows drawn. "And what did you want in return?" Marcus had looked at him for a long moment. "I wanted accountability," he had said quietly. "Not revenge." The executive had exhaled sharply, as if relieved. "Good. Then we could resolve this privately." Marcus's eyes had remained steady. It wasn't going to be private. The room had gone still. Marcus had continued, calm but firm. Private resolutions protected the same patterns. They allowed people to call it a misunderstanding and move on. That was how it kept happening. The lawyer had shifted uncomfortably. "What were you proposing, Mr. Holloway?" Marcus had opened the folder to a page marked with a simple tab. It had listed requirements: an independent investigation into discriminatory practices at the marina and within the firm's event security protocols, mandatory bias and de-escalation training for contracted security, a public apology that named the harm rather than hiding behind vague language, and funding for community programs tied to access and opportunity. The executive's face had tightened. "You are asking for a lot." Marcus's voice had softened, but the words had carried weight. "I was asking for what it cost," he had said. "You just weren't used to paying the bill." No one had spoken for a moment. Outside, a gull had passed the window, wings steady. Then the executive had murmured, "This could affect our investors." Marcus had nodded once. "It should," he had replied. "They deserve to know what kind of culture they were funding." The lawyer had tried again. "But the security team." Marcus had interrupted gently. "They were doing more than their job." He had leaned forward slightly. "They were enforcing an assumption. And assumptions like that didn't happen by accident. They were trained. They were rewarded. They were normalized." The executive had swallowed. Marcus had reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. He had set it on the table. It had been a photo of the crayon drawing from his hallway. "Thank you for fixing things." "I built my life on fixing things," Marcus had said quietly. "Not just infrastructure. Systems. Patterns. Damage." He had looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. "I wasn't interested in humiliating anyone," he had said. "But I wasn't willing to pretend nothing happened." The lawyer had asked, "What would you say publicly, then?" Marcus had been silent for a moment, as if choosing words he could live with. Then he had spoken, and his voice had sounded like a man telling the truth in a room built for half-truths. "I would say this," he had said. "Dignity wasn't something people earned by looking the part. Dignity was the starting point. And when you took it away from someone because you guessed wrong about their value, you didn't just insult them. You exposed yourself." The executive had rubbed his forehead. "You were going to make this a moral lesson." Marcus had nodded. "It already was one," he had replied. "The world just finally filmed it." The fallout had begun within days. The investment firm had released a statement, but at first it had been the kind of statement that tried to float above responsibility. "We regret the misunderstanding. We value inclusion. We were reviewing protocols." The internet had laughed at the vagueness, then had turned angry. People had demanded names. They had demanded details. They had demanded consequences. Sponsors had started to withdraw. At first, they had done it quietly, with private emails and polite phone calls. Then one major sponsor had posted a public announcement, and the dam had broken. The firm's stock had dipped, then slid. Not because the company had been insolvent, because reputation was a currency, and the market had responded to the scent of rot. The marina manager had suspended the security company pending investigation. The older guard had been placed on leave. The younger guard had quit before he could be fired, his resignation letter reportedly filled with excuses and fear. The event director had been terminated within a week. Her name had trended online, followed by comment threads that swung between fury and cruelty. Marcus had refused to comment on her personally. When reporters had asked whether he felt satisfied that she lost her job, he had answered in a way that had frustrated people looking for revenge. "I didn't want her life destroyed," he had said. "I wanted her to understand what she was part of." But understanding had not been trending. Outrage had. Marcus had watched from a distance as the story mutated online. People had turned it into memes and punchlines, as the internet always did. Some had treated it like a fairy tale of instant justice. Marcus had known better. Real justice was slow. Real change was uncomfortable. The firm had been forced into an internal audit. A board member had resigned. A second had followed. An independent investigator had been hired under public pressure. The marina had announced new access policies, new oversight for event security, and mandatory training. Some people had praised it as progress. Others had called it performative. Marcus had not cared what it was called. He had cared whether it held. A week after the viral moment, Marcus had stood on the deck of his newly acquired yacht alone at night. The Aurora Belle had been silent without the party. The water had been dark, and the city lights had painted thin, trembling lines across it. Marcus had leaned against the railing and stared out, breathing in salt air and quiet. He had thought about the rope line again, and how that single strip of fabric had carried the weight of 1,000 invisible rules. He had thought about the boys he had grown up with, boys who had been smart, funny, full of potential, and who had still been treated like threats the moment they stepped into certain neighborhoods. He had thought about his father's hands and his mother's tired smile. He had thought about the first time he had been called sir in a room that had meant it. He had wondered how many people never got that moment. His phone had buzzed with a message from Leona. "You okay?" Marcus had stayed at the screen for a long moment before replying. "I was steady, but I was tired." A second message had come quickly. "Then rest. Tomorrow we keep building." Marcus had smiled faintly. "Tomorrow we keep building." It had sounded like a vow. The next morning, Marcus had held a press conference, but not the kind filled with flashing smiles and rehearsed sound bites. He had stood at the marina entrance with a yacht in the background. No dramatic music, no fireworks, just him, a microphone, and a small crowd of reporters and community members. The air had been bright and salty. Cameras had been pointed at him. Marcus had waited until the noise settled, until the questions paused, until the moment had been his. Then he had spoken calmly. "I wanted to say something," he had begun, "and I wanted to say it clearly." The crowd had quieted. Marcus had continued. "What happened on this dock wasn't rare. It was just filmed." A reporter had called out, "Do you believe it was racism?" Marcus had paused, eyes steady. "I believed it was bias," he had said. And bias didn't need a burning cross to do damage. Bias could wear a badge and a smile and still shut a door in your face. Another reporter had asked, "Why did you buy the yacht?" Marcus had glanced toward the vessel behind him. "I was already buying it," he had said. But that wasn't the point. He had leaned slightly toward the microphone, voice even but carrying. "The point was this," he had said. "When you decided who belonged based on how they looked, you weren't protecting anything. You were revealing something." A murmur had moved through the crowd. Marcus had continued, and his tone had softened. "I didn't cancel that event because I wanted revenge," he had said. "I canceled it because I wanted interruption. I wanted the pattern to stop long enough for people to see it." He had paused. Then he had delivered the words that would later spread across social media in captions and posters, words that would be quoted in classrooms and boardrooms and church sermons. "Treat people like they belong," Marcus had said, "before you learn they do." Silence had held for a beat. Then cameras had clicked. People had nodded. A woman in the crowd had wiped at her eyes, surprised by tears. Marcus had lifted his hands slightly, palms open, as if offering something rather than demanding. Dignity wasn't a wristband, he had said. It wasn't a guest list. It wasn't something you earned by looking expensive enough. It was something you owed each other because you were human. A reporter had asked, "What did you want to happen now?" Marcus had nodded toward the marina manager standing nearby, stiff with nervousness. "I wanted policies," he had said. "Training, oversight, transparency. And I wanted the people who were harmed by this kind of gatekeeping over and over, quietly, to be part of building the fix." He had turned his gaze back to the cameras. "I wasn't asking you to cancel everyone," he had said. "I was asking you to see everyone." He had ended the press conference then, stepping away without posing for photos. He had not smiled for the cameras. He had simply walked back toward the dock with the unhurried pace of a man who had work to do. In the weeks that followed, Marcus had done what he always did. He had built. He had met with community leaders and educators. He had funded a program that trained young adults for jobs in infrastructure, engineering, and skilled trades, fields that built the world but often shut out the very communities that needed them most. He had created mentorship weekends on the yacht, not as a symbol of wealth, but as a symbol of access. He had invited kids who had never seen a yacht up close to step on board and feel their own worth without permission. He had insisted the staff be paid fairly and treated with respect. He had installed a new policy on his vessel: no guest list that excluded without reason, no security that escalated without cause, no vetted language that hid prejudice. He had renamed the yacht. The gold letters had been removed from the stern. New letters had been installed in their place, bold and clear. "Keep your word." Reporters had asked why. Marcus had answered simply, "Because that was the only kind of wealth worth having." Not everyone had been pleased. Some wealthy circles had called Marcus dramatic. Some had accused him of using the moment for publicity. Some had said he should have handled it privately. Marcus had listened to those comments the way he had listened to wind: present, loud, and ultimately powerless if you stayed rooted. He had been criticized by people who had never been denied entry anywhere. He had been praised by people who had been denied their whole lives. But Marcus had not moved based on praise or criticism. He had moved based on purpose. 1 month after the incident, Marcus had received a letter from the younger guard who had first blocked him. The envelope had been plain, the handwriting uneven. Marcus had opened it alone in his office. The letter had been messy, filled with excuses, then apology, then shame. The guard had written that he had been just doing his job, then admitted he had made assumptions, then confessed he had been scared when the crowd started recording, and he had doubled down to protect his ego. He had written that his father had been sick, that he had needed the job, that he had been desperate. Marcus had read the letter twice. He had not dismissed it. He had not accepted it blindly either. He had sat for a long time staring at the paper, feeling the old tension between accountability and compassion. Then he had asked Leona to set up a meeting. When the young man had arrived, he had looked smaller without the uniform. He had held his hands together tightly, knuckles white. Marcus had offered him water. The young man had stammered, "I didn't deserve to sit here." Marcus had replied calmly, "You deserve to learn." The young man's eyes had filled. "I was sorry," he had whispered. "I didn't think." Marcus had lifted a hand gently. "You did think," he had said. "You just thought the wrong things. And you thought them fast because the world trained you to." The young man had swallowed hard. Marcus had leaned forward slightly. "It was the truth," Marcus had said softly. "Most of the harm in the world wasn't done by monsters. It was done by ordinary people protecting their comfort." He had let the words settle. Then he had continued, "But ordinary people could change too, if they were willing to feel the discomfort they tried to avoid." The young man had nodded, tears slipping. Marcus had offered him a path. Not a reward, a responsibility. Marcus had connected him to a training program Marcus funded, security and event. Operations training focused on de-escalation, bias awareness, and professionalism. The young man had accepted, shaking. When he left, Marcus had felt something heavy loosen slightly in his chest. Not because everything was fixed, because one piece had moved. The older guard had not written a letter. He had fought the investigation, argued, blamed protocol, and insisted Marcus had been the problem for creating a scene. The independent report released months later had been brutal. It had cited patterns of discriminatory enforcement, selective suspicion, and repeated incidents of guest denial that disproportionately impacted people of color, older guests, and those without visible markers of wealth. The report had included data, testimonies, and bodycam footage. The marina had terminated the security company's contract permanently. The older guard had been blacklisted from several venues. He had gone on a small podcast, complaining about wokeness and entitled people. The internet had moved on quickly. But Marcus had not forgotten. Not because he wanted vengeance. Because he wanted to remember what resistance looked like when people were confronted with their own bias. 3 months after the dock incident, Marcus had hosted the first scholarship fundraiser on Keep Your Word. The deck had been decorated simply. No ostentation, no gold-plated nonsense. String lights had hung like soft stars. Food had been prepared by local caterers. Music had been played by a student jazz trio. The guests had been different too. There had been engineers and teachers and nurses. There had been small business owners. There had been students in borrowed suits and dresses, nervous but proud. And there had been parents who had looked around the yacht with quiet disbelief, as if they expected someone to stop them. Marcus had welcomed them personally at the gangway, not with a rope, with a handshake and eye contact. A woman in her 50s had approached hesitantly, clutching her purse as if it were armor. "I wasn't sure I should come," she had admitted softly. Marcus had smiled gently. "Why not?" She had swallowed. "Places like this, they don't usually feel like they were made for us." Marcus's eyes had softened. "Then we would make them feel that way," he had said. Her face had crumpled, and she had pressed a hand to her mouth to hold an emotion. Later that night, a teenage girl had stood near the railing, staring at the city lights. Marcus had approached quietly and stood beside her, giving her space. She had whispered, almost to herself, "I didn't know I could be here." Marcus had looked at her, and he had seen something familiar, a version of himself at 16, watching other people's worlds from the outside. "You could," Marcus had said softly, "and you should." She had turned toward him, eyes wide. "But how?" Marcus had rested his hands on the railing. "By refusing to believe the lie," he had said. "The lie that you were too small, too different, too late." She had nodded slowly. Marcus had added, "And by building something so solid they couldn't ignore you." The girl had breathed out shakily. "I want to be an engineer," she had said. Marcus had smiled. "Then we would help you get there," he had replied. The fundraiser had raised enough money to fund 50 scholarships. It had also raised something less measurable, belief. The yacht had become a place where young people took photos not to prove they had been near luxury, but to remind themselves they belonged in spaces they planned to reshape. The marina had changed too. New signage had been posted explaining access policies clearly. A verification desk had been staffed by marina employees rather than outsourced security alone. Bodycams and visible name badges had become mandatory for all contracted guards. A public reporting system had been established for discrimination complaints, with oversight from an independent committee that included community representatives. Some people had called it overkill. Marcus had called it necessary. Trust wasn't rebuilt with slogans, he had told the marina manager. It was rebuilt with structure. 6 months after the confrontation, the dock had looked different. Not because the wood had changed, because the air had. Families had walked along the waterfront without feeling watched. Kids had pointed at yachts with innocent excitement instead of cautious distance. Tourists had snapped photos without being shooed away for not looking like they belonged. Keep Your Word had sat at Pier 7 like a quiet monument. One bright afternoon, a group of teens from Marcus's program had stepped onto the deck for a mentorship session. They had moved slowly, eyes wide, like the yacht might vanish if they walked too confidently. A boy in a worn hoodie had stared at the polished railings and then at Marcus. "You really own this?" he had asked, voice half disbelief, half awe. "I did," Marcus had replied. The boy had frowned. "Then why'd you let us on it? Like, why'd you invite us?" Marcus had leaned on the railing, gaze drifting out to the water. "Because the first time someone told me I didn't belong," Marcus had said, "I believed them for a moment." The teens had gone quiet. "And that moment cost me years," Marcus had continued softly. Years of shrinking, years of asking permission, years of trying to own dignity that should have been mine already. The boy had swallowed hard. What changed? Marcus had looked back at him. I did, he had said. I stopped waiting for someone else to open the door. He had paused, then added, and when I finally walked through, I realized something. The teens leaned in without meaning to. Marcus's voice had been gentle but steady. The door wasn't just locked for me, he had said. It was locked for a lot of people. And if I had the power to unlock it, I had the responsibility to. The boy had blinked fast, pretending his eyes weren't wet. What if people still tried to stop us? Another teen had asked. Marcus had smiled faintly. They would, he had replied. But they would get tired before you did if you kept building. That evening, after the teens had left, Marcus had walked alone down the dock. The sun had been setting, turning the sky into a bruised gradient of gold and purple. He had stopped near the marina entrance where a mural had been painted. It had shown a man in a blazer standing calmly at a rope line, phones raised around him, a yacht gleaming behind. Above the painted figure were words in bold letters. Dignity doesn't require an invitation. Marcus had stayed at the mural for a long time. He had not felt triumphant. He had felt reflective, because that day on the dock had not been a fairy tale. It had been a flash of truth, a reminder that power could shift in an instant, but bias could rebuild itself if people weren't vigilant. Leona had approached quietly, hands in her coat pockets. You were thinking, she had said. Marcus had nodded. I was thinking about how easy it was, he had murmured. How easy what was, she had asked. How easy it was for them to assume I was nobody, Marcus had said. How easy it was for the crowd to believe it. How easy it was for authority to point a finger. And everyone followed until ownership changed the script. Leona had looked at the mural. And how easy it was for you to flip it, she had said. Marcus had shaken his head slowly. It wasn't easy, he had replied. It was expensive. It took decades. And that was the part that hurt. Leona had frowned. What part? Marcus had turned toward her, eyes tired. That the world treated me with respect only after I became too costly to disrespect, he had said quietly. That shouldn't be how dignity worked. Leona had been silent. Marcus had looked back at the painted rope line. I didn't want people to cheer because I bought a yacht, he had said. I wanted them to notice the rope. Leona had nodded, her eyes shining in the dusk. They did, she had said. A lot of people did. Marcus had exhaled slowly. I hoped so, he had replied. He had started walking again, footsteps steady on the wood. Behind him, Keep Your Word had gleamed softly under marina lights, not as a symbol of luxury, but as a symbol of what could happen when someone refused to shrink. And somewhere out in the world, people who had watched the clip months ago were still replaying the moment in their minds. Not the purchase, not the cancellation, but the calm way Marcus had stood at the rope line while the crowd watched and the siren approached. Because in that calm, there had been a challenge, a question, a mirror, and that mirror was still there, waiting for whoever stood closest to it next. So here was the question that lingered, quiet but unavoidable. When you saw someone being told they didn't belong, when the crowd watched, when authority escalated, when a camera recorded, would you stay silent and let the rope tighten? Or would you speak, before you learned the person on the other side of that rope had power too?